Hello, I'm John Paladna, and we're in downtown Racine this afternoon in front of Copacetic. And we're going to meet Dustin Block and Pete Selkowe, the two creators of RacinePost.com. So let's go inside. Well, here we are inside of Copacetic with Pete Selkowe and Dustin Block, the two creators of RacinePost.com. And I have just one general question for you this morning. Now, have either of you palled around with known terrorists?
No, not at all. You got no proof.
Okay, you know, in 6 months, nobody will understand that was an attempt at a joke.
Right.
But we're going to do a two-part interview with Pete and Dustin. And the first part, we're going to talk a little bit about their background. And through my superior powers of observation, I noticed that Pete seems to be just slightly older than Dustin, and so we'll give him the kudos here and let him go first. And what was your academic background, first of all?
Well, I went to college, got a degree in journalism, English and journalism. But I don't think that the college degree is what did it. What did it for me was my first real job in newspapers was at a small town daily in New Hampshire that I spent 4 years at and learned everything there.
What about that job really got you into journalism?
Oh, everything about it. It was the Keene Sentinel. Let's a shout out to the Keene Sentinel. 10,000, 11, 12,000 circulation newspaper, family owned. A newsroom of about 10 people, but it was in New Hampshire in the 60s. And in New Hampshire in the 60s, one of the things that you had was presidential primaries. And the presidential primaries brought everybody, Nixon, Humphrey, Romney, all the top people and all the kooks as well. And you had unfettered access to them. I met Nixon in his hotel room and Romney in his hotel room, just me and the candidate for hours. And you learned very quickly that you did everything. And you learned very quickly whether you did it right, because the readers who didn't like it would come into the newspaper, walk off Main Street, come into the newspaper, and tell you if you did it wrong. So you learned very quickly how to be a journalist.
Boy, for a young guy, you could hardly have anything better than that.
It was the perfect job. I felt so sorry for the big men on campus, the important people who were head of the newspaper on campus and so forth, and went out of school and got jobs as reporters on the Boston Globe, which was the place to be. And they got none of the experience that I had.
Well, let's jump a little bit now, because you're into a new online newspaper. What were the intellectuals and the big thinkers thinking, way back in the 60s about what was going to be the great frontier for journalism?
I don't know what they were thinking then, but in terms of newspapers, it was a whole different world. We had, I think Boston had 7 dailies at the time, and New York had 9 or 10. And I don't think any of us had any clue that print was going to die off at some point in our lifetimes.
Okay. Well, Dustin, let's go to you a little bit and talk a little bit about your academic background.
Sure. Well, I went to Madison, University of Wisconsin, and I didn't go wanting to be in journalism at all. I actually had no interest in it. And but I met a guy like right when I first started, and he said, "Hey, I'm writing for the student paper, and I think it'd be interesting." So I said, well, I've never done that before, but all right, I'll give it a shot. So I walked in the door, and I thought there'd be an interview process or something like that. And now these papers, they're desperate for people, right? So they walked in and they gave me an assignment and said, write a story about Tommy Thompson running for president. And I was like, okay. So I went out, and I'm talking to the governor's office, and I'm talking to these professors, and it's, I think, kind of like your experience, where it was just like this incredible access, and people would actually answer my questions, and then I loved it because it was on deadline, so I'm running all over campus, and from that story on, I was just hooked. So I did study journalism at Madison, but to be honest, it was kind of a waste of time, especially at that time. The school was more advertising-based, communications-based, so I really learned everything from just working at the student paper day in and day out, how to write a story, how to edit.
So the Governor Thompson story was your very first story?
Yeah, I think I even remember my first sentence. It was like something like, riding the wave of a 67% gubernatorial victory. Tommy Thompson has his sights set on the White House or something like that. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing when you can remember your first sentence.
I know, yeah, absolutely. And what's funny is we have family friends who he was the advisor of the high school paper where I went to school, and he kept for years trying to get me to come out for it. And I was like, nah, I'm not interested at all. And I wrote one story and I was hooked, pretty much for good. So yeah.
Oh, what a great story. Well, let's jump a little bit now. I know you have a huge resume, especially here in Racine. Can you share with us a little bit, a few of the highlights? I know we could go on and on in the details, but some of your highlights here in Racine.
Boy, that's a tough one. My highlights in Racine. I think the thing that I came to Racine in '95 as publisher, and I think the thing that I did best in Racine, and it was just by luck I walked into it. I walked into the newspaper, and about 2 months later I was summoned to a board meeting at All Saints, and sitting around the boardroom table were all the captains of industry who were on the board of All Saints, and they basically told me that the newspaper was killing their ability to hire people because the newspaper was focused on crime and negativity, if you will, and they couldn't get people to come to work. They would fly in a doctor and his wife, and they would wine and dine the doctor and show him where he'd work and how much money he'd get, and he'd be thrilled. Meanwhile, the wife would go around town and look at the paper and say, I'm not coming here. And so one of the first things I did when I came to Racine was start us on a new direction. We started something called Celebrate Racine. We did a page a week of something, a major story on something good that was in Racine. And we changed our focus, basically. It's not that crime doesn't belong in the paper, but it doesn't have to dominate it. And I think for 2 years we changed the focus of the newspaper and started changing, I'm not going to take credit for changing it, but started changing the perception of Racine that Racine had of itself. And so I'm proudest of that here, I think, exception.
Well, as an aside, Racine is on quite an upward swing with all the community-based things that they have going on now.
Racine's an incredible upward swing, and it has been for, I'd say, 20 years or so. When I came here, the waterfront had just begun to be done. Main Street had not yet been done. The condo boom hadn't happened. The Johnson building was a vacant lot and had been for 20 years. I remember soon after I came to town, I met Mayor Smith, and I argued with him about how can you leave that there for so long vacant? And he said, well, we're waiting for the right thing to happen. And he told me some of the wrong things that had come in and offered to buy it, and I think he was right. But geez, it shouldn't have taken 20 years.
Your situation, how long you've been in journalism and what your previous positions have been in coming to Racine, etc.
Sure. Well, I started being in Madison. I worked for a company called Madison Newspapers at the time, owned by Lee Enterprises. And so my first jobs were all with them over there. And I worked for a weekly paper in Sun Prairie for a year, and then I saw an opening in Racine, and I applied for it, and they hired me on as the what they called the suburban reporter. So it was Sturtevant, Mount Pleasant, Caledonia. And I did that for about a year. And then, at the time I came, they didn't even have email addresses for any of the reporters and things like that. And we had just gotten those brand new iMac computers, And so it was just kind of evolving into the internet era. And so I was real interested in that. So they were just starting to talk about website. And so I'd say, oh, let's do this. And so they moved me over to be what they called at the time, Internet Content Coordinator. And that basically was the person who put stuff up on the website. We were really bad at it. We had no idea what we were doing, but we were kind of ahead of a lot of papers our size, because no one knew what they were doing at the time. So I did that for about a year, and then I moved back over to reporting for a while, and then became an editor, and I eventually became city editor for 3-4 years, something like that. And then about a year ago, last September, October, I left to do freelance writing and then to start looking at some other options, and Racine Post came out of that. So,
well, you really had a breadth of experience with the Journal Times.
Yeah, they just kept moving me to spot to spot, and part of it I think I was just the only one that was willing to do like the amount of work, because it was I just loved it, so I would be there constantly, and by doing that all the time, I just kind of worked my way up into an editor position, and I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I was young. I was definitely young at the time, but it just kind of fit, with what we were trying to do. Some things we were trying to do with the paper. So.
Well, this really segues very well into our second part, where we're going to come back and we're going to talk about what kind of things happened to have you all start RacinePost.com.